Hi, I'm great. Thanks so much. All right, I'm going to share my screen. Uh, there we go. Everybody can see. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Hunter. It's great to be here. I always love the Power to Fly summits. They're always so great. So let's dive in. So a quick history of women's workforce participation in the paid workforce. And I want to underline the fact that we're talking about participation in the paid workforce. Women work, have always worked. Um, but when BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, started collecting data in 1948, about 35% of women between the ages of 25 and 54 were participating in the paid labor force. BLS tends to focus a lot of their attention on that age group, 25 to 54. It's the age at which most people have completed their formal education, and it's before most people start retiring. Plenty of people work who are younger than 25, plenty of people work past the ages of 54, obviously, but those are considered sort of literally the prime working ages. So between 1970 and 1993, the rate of women's workforce participation rose 25 points from 50% to 75%. And that makes sense when you think about a lot of the things that were keeping women out of the paid workforce before 1970 were legal barriers, right? It was legal to not give a woman a job for being a woman. It was legal to fire married women. It was legal to fire pregnant women, right? All of these different laws that got changed through the 60s and early 70s, and we started to see that rise. But then between 1993 and today, it's only gone up 3 points. So yes, it hit an all-time high of nearly, almost, not quite 78% at the end of 2024. But that's only a 3 point rise in about 30 years. And by contrast, at the end of 2024, 89% of men 25 to 54 were participating in the paid labor force. So I want to show this on a graph because I think this really illustrates, and I will be sending a PDF of these slides to the Power to Fly folks, and they'll make them available to you. Because I think you can really see that plateau of women's workforce participation from the 90s to now. And when you think about the rate now, which there have been quite a few headlines about like women's return to the paid workforce and higher than ever. But really, we're talking about 3 points that we have gained and lost across these 30 years, right? We hit 77% in the late 90s. It went down again after the Great Recession. It went up again, and it actually hit its highest rate right before the pandemic in 2020, and then of course fell for all the reasons that we know. So we've kind of been gaining and losing the same 3 points for the last 30 years, and we're not making traction. So what are the barriers to women's paid work? And again, I want to keep emphasizing paid work. It's caregiving. It's caregiving. It's caregiving, right? Um, it's caregiving because women spend more time on unpaid work, which limits their ability to engage in paid work. And there's plenty of time use studies that show that the total amount of time of both genders, of men and women, self-identified men and women, spending time in work, things that we would categorize as work, tends to be close to equal. It's just men are spending more time in paid work versus women who spend more time in unpaid work on average, statistically. It's also because women are discriminated against in the workforce because of care responsibilities, which can obviously lead to all kinds of bad outcomes for them in the paid workforce, but can push them out of the paid workforce, right? When women find their careers getting stalled, they're not moving up, they're not making more money, they start to question, like, well, is this really worth it? I could be spending more time. I'm spending so much on childcare. So that discrimination against women because of their caregiving responsibilities can actually lead to them getting pushed out of the workforce altogether. And then when they do leave, whether it's because they feel like they were pushed out or they wanted to leave to spend some time with their families, they're then discriminated against when they try to re-enter the workforce after those breaks for care. So why should we care about women's workforce participation? Does it matter? Is this something that we should focus on? And if people don't want to work, if they have the means to not work, is that just kind of fine? And I would say that there are two big reasons. I mean, one reason I think we should all care is that it's good for business, it's good for the economy. Lots of people working, right? Having an available labor force is good for economic reasons generally. But I would say there's two main reasons why we should care about women's workforce participation. And I think of these as the microeconomic reason and the macroeconomic reason. The microeconomic reason is that lack of paid work leaves women financially vulnerable. This is a big part of why we see gaps between men and women in terms of pay, in terms of wealth, um, higher rates of poverty in retirement for women than men generally. And so we live in a country that doesn't have a lot of social programs and social support. So unlike other countries, we don't have health care that's available to all workers or all people, regardless of whether or not they're attached to the paid workforce. We don't offer paid leave. We don't have a lot of great income support for people who are not attached to the paid workforce, right? And so this chart from the Hamilton Project, which is from 2017, it's 2016 data, these numbers, as we just saw, don't move a lot year over year, shows that most of the people who are not participating in the workforce, who are women, are not participating because they're engaged in caregiving, right? That's that big green box is the 36% of non-participants who are women who are home for caregiving, who are taking care of their children, elderly parents, other people with health issues, right? They're engaged in caregiving. And so you see all the other categories of reasons for non-participation. Men and women are equal, right? Equal numbers of men and women who are out of the workforce for disability, who early retired, who are students. But you see that big difference between the number of women who are engaged in caregiving. So these women are working. I want to emphasize that, right? They are working. They're just not getting paid for their work. So a little homework for everyone, if you're so inclined. A great book, very readable too, even if you're not an economics geek. A very, very readable book. Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner? And it's about how we look at GDP, how we look at the economics, and how we categorize different types of work. And the spoiler alert to the title is Who Cooked Adam Smith's Dinner? His mom. But the second reason, and this is what I think of as the macro reason, is that fewer women in the workforce leads to fewer women in leadership. These two things are related, but they're also different. And they're different enough that I want to really call attention to this because I think it's an important piece of the puzzle. And I think it's important to call it out separately in part because I think there are a lot of things we could do to help support more women in the paid workforce, which still might not actually lead to more women in leadership. So they're different. There are different mechanisms, but I think it's important to pair them because you got to be in it to win it, is the way I think about it, right? Like when more women leave the workforce, there are fewer women who are then available for those leadership positions, or the women who are available haven't got as much experience as men because they haven't spent as much time in the workforce, right? So the more women who are out of the paid workforce, and the more that gap between men and women in terms of paid workforce participation, the fewer women in the pipeline as they move through their career and through their life, really, to be available for those bigger jobs. So this chart shows the percentage of Fortune 500 CEOs and also board members. This is from the last talk I gave here at Power to Fly about women in power, but I wanted to use it again today because I want to show you can see that bottom orange line, which is the women CEOs, is as flat, right, as that women's participation line, and quite a bit lower, right? Like we're seeing only, we still have not cracked 10% of Fortune 500 CEOs who are women. And we see similar stats. The numbers are slightly better for other senior positions, right? So if you look at a lot of different research on women in C-suite positions and different senior leadership positions, you'll see 80-20, 85-15, right? The delta is still quite large between men and women in those leadership positions. Why does this matter? I think it matters even as much or more than the financial security for individual women, because women having a seat at the table is an important component to seeing women represented in our society, right? I often talk about the fact that, right, we've done a lot of work over the last couple decades about trying to get more women into political power, and that's yielded some results, and in fact, maybe yielded better results than even on corporate power, right, where there's more women in Congress than ever before, more women in state congressional houses, more women governors. Women have really made gains in political power, and that's important because obviously our political leaders make a lot of decisions about our lives, but corporate leaders also make a lot of decisions about our lives, right? We're talking a lot in recent news cycles about Medicaid and Medicare and Social Security. But a lot of healthcare decisions get made by the executives at Aetna, at CVS, at Pfizer, right? having women at the table at these companies makes a difference, both in terms of how those companies perform, but also in terms of decisions that get made that affect all of us as citizens, consumers, and people. So, what can employers do to support women in the paid workforce? And in the question and answer section, we can talk a little bit about what we all can do, but I wanted to focus on employers for a minute. And I think that many of us have roles to play here as managers and recruiters and hiring managers, and also things that we can do to pressure our own companies. I think the most important, or one of the most important things, is to create pathways for people who want to return to work after long breaks. I worked previously for an organization that did returnships. There's other organizations out there that do that, that create these internship opportunities for people returning to the workforce. There's other innovative ideas around pathways back to paid work, but creating those pathways, having employers need to be intentional about bringing people who have been out of the workforce back into the workforce and making those opportunities available to people of either gender who have left the workforce for caregiving. We also need to stop discriminating against people with gaps in their work history. And we see this all the time, where people who had even relatively short periods away from the paid workforce find it very difficult to get even interviews to return to the paid workforce. So there's an organization called Opportunity at Work that you may have seen some of their public service announcements about tearing down the paper ceiling, right? Making more jobs available to people who might not have a college degree but have the experience and skills to do that job, which I love, by the way. I'm a huge fan of tear the paper ceiling. But I think we need to do something different with something similar with gaps, like stop discriminating against people just because they have a gap in service. And finally, offering more flexibility to all employees. I've been very worried about all of these return to office mandates. Obviously, for some companies, they may make sense, but there's a lot of evidence to suggest that one of the reasons that women's paid workforce participation has stayed relatively high since the pandemic, hitting that all-time high and kind of staying there for the last couple of years as opposed to sliding back, is because there's been more opportunity for women to work flexibly, work in hybrid situations and those kinds of things. So continuing to offer that flexibility to all employees is a big and important part of how we can support women's workforce participation. All right, so I'm going to open it up for questions. Before I do that, really quickly, I'm Tami Forman. I have a free newsletter at How We Do It. I know they're going to put the link in the chat. So that is the best way to get in touch with me and to kind of like interact with me. I write, you can leave comments there, but you can also follow me on LinkedIn. I'm on Blue Sky. I'm technically still on whatever we call the Bird app, but I don't do much there anymore. So but I'm generally Tami M. Forman on all the socials, so you can feel free to find me on your favorite platform. All right, so I think we have questions, and I'm happy to take questions from the audience, whatever we got.
Awesome. Thank you for that, Tami. Well, yeah, so as Tami said, if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and I will happily relay them on your behalf. Tami, so I appreciate the info there, a bit of how we do it, but tell me, why do you do it? What got you so passionate about this? Why did you make this what you want to do?
Hunter, that's an awesome question. I am a Gen X gal. Went to college in the 90s, and the dream of the new day was upon us, right? I was in college with men and women, and we were all doing our thing. And I just assumed this was, as I sat in these college classrooms, which were generally gender balanced, I just thought that was going to be life. I was going to I was going to go to work, and it was going to we were all going to happily march forward. And then I woke up in the 2000s, and I was like, wait, hold on, where'd the women go? What happened? And
Mhm.
particularly in leadership, it was very striking to me to watch the companies that I worked for, even very good companies that were actually good for women, just not seeing women in leadership, and particularly not seeing mothers in leadership, and saying, I think I'm on to something here. And feeling like we had not quite made as much progress as maybe we thought we had, because we made a lot of progress in terms of dismantling legal barriers to women's workforce participation, but hadn't fully dismantled the cultural barriers. Um, and I fear that they are being retrenched as we speak.
Yeah. So in this time that of what you're speaking to is more rights and advocacy and empowerment for a lot of folks. What do you see as the way forward right now when we're working within a system that might be working against us?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think the average family needs to think about like what's going to make them happy and thrive, right? And think about how they can construct their own life, right? Like I also believe very strongly that men would like to spend more time with their families too, right? And men would like to be engaged um, in caregiving and in being involved fathers, in being there for their parents and for other people in their lives. So I think there's an actual opportunity for certainly within heterosexual couple families to think more broadly about how we can do this and kind of filter out the noise that's going on around, the culture war nonsense, which I think most people think is a little bit silly, and focus on like what would make us all happy? How can we all have the time that we need and be able to afford the life that we want and finance the things that we want to do? And how can we be a partner and equal in that, in ways that benefit everyone and the whole family? And I think from a management perspective and an executive perspective, I think if you're an executive, you have to start to ask yourself the question of like, am I getting the best and brightest if I'm not making it easy for people to participate equally, right? Like again, filtering out all the noise about like this and that, but like unless we fundamentally believe that women are less smart than men or less talented than men or less capable than men, the only explanation for the gap in leadership, for example, because women have been getting college degrees and have been getting advanced degrees, right? We outpace men at this point, but then the explanation has to be there are barriers that are keeping them from being in the workforce and advancing in the workforce, because otherwise you have to conclude that actually maybe men are just better. I don't think most executives really believe. I hope they don't.
Yeah, I hope not too.
Right. So that again, and I want to just emphasize like it's about getting the best and brightest. If you want the best people on your team, you should be thinking about like, okay, does it look, does it reflect the fact that talent and opportunity are equally distributed?
Right. So how can employers do a better job to support women's workforce participation and upward mobility within companies?
I think a big thing would be, I mean, I think the returnships and other pathways for people to return to the workforce are great. I think some flexibility stuff is great. Like all of those things. I think part of it is about talent executives, people who are thinking about their long-term workforce needs, right? Not just how many seats do I have to fill this quarter, but like what does my workforce look like for the next 5, 10 years or more, right? Is thinking about employees, thinking less about the conveyor belt slash ladder, right? That people are just kind of like going along, moving up, 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 or maybe moving across, 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 but they're just gonna like get little widgets that just kind of keep going in one direction. And instead thinking more in terms of like people may shift within our workforce. They may move up, they may move across, they may move down for a bit, and that's not a gendered thing, right? That there are still some gendered pieces of that because women are more likely to have those responsibilities, but that we think about our employees as people who may have different needs across their life cycle, which means they have to have different needs across their employee cycle with us. So what we saw a lot in like the 80s and the 90s is women going onto what was often called the mommy track, right? So you were either going up and that was great, or you were gonna you needed more flexibility and you needed to be a good mom, so you're gonna go this way, and then you never go up again. And I'm saying like I think there's an opportunity to think about that a little bit differently, where people might go up for a bit, go sideways for a bit, but then start going up again, and that we could support those more jungle gym approaches versus the straight up the ladder kind of approach.
Yeah. Excuse me. So what policy changes do you think like paid family leave or flexible work arrangements? What do you think would have the most impact for women's participation in the labor force, paid labor force?
Yes. So on the public policy side, there is no question that paid leave and gender equitable paid leave would have the biggest impact, right? That is absolutely essential, um, because a lot of times if women don't have access to paid leave, they can't return to their work. And if they don't, and there's a lot of research that labor economists do on like when someone's detached from the workforce, it's harder to get, just in general, right, harder to get back to the workforce. So the more we can do to support women to stay attached to the paid labor force, the more likely they will stay and continue in their paid work. The other one is childcare, 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 right? That is absolutely the thing that forces women out of the workforce. And I have become a big advocate of public financing for childcare much more than employer solutions. If employers want to offer benefits around whatever, employers can do what employers are going to do. But we don't ask employers to subsidize third grade, right? Like we don't expect employers to, pay for high school for the children of their employees, right? That's a public good that we think of as a public good. And I think we should see early childhood support in the same way, that it's a public good that people need to be able to work and do all the kinds of other things, right? That it's good to educate children and start them early. There's all kinds of research on that. But that is also an economic good, right? That childcare is as essential to the workforce as roads and bridges and subways, right? Like that people need childcare in order to be able to work, and that we should think of that as something that is the infrastructure. A lot of people in the care economy talk about care as infrastructure that is required for men and women to be able to participate fully in the workforce.
Yeah. So you in 2016 you founded Path Forward, which is a
Yeah.
nonprofit that empowers family givers, caregivers to return to paid work. And you worked with huge companies. You did that for 7 years, over 100 companies, Apple, Netflix, Amazon, Walmart, Pepsi, the list goes on, to get them through, return ships. So I'd love to hear about what was the shift between you had this business, this foundation that you created, and now you've moved into a different role, and
Yes.
how has this new role impacted the way you work with people?
Yeah, so I decided at the end of 2022 that it was time for me to take a break. So having worked with women who had taken a career break for 7 years, I was like, that actually looks kind of good. I think that I will take some time off. But I still felt like I had a lot to say about these issues. And so, I started my newsletter because I wanted to be able to continue writing about um, issues around women and gender equality and women at work, and talk about them at places like Power to Fly and other places where I do speaking, because I think these issues are really important, and I think we're not making progress fast enough, and I feel like there's just more to be done there.
And how is the response and the give and take with the community that you've been fostering through the newsletter?
It's amazing. People, I mean, some of it is very, people just want to figure out how they can get jobs and get back to work. So there's things around networking and like, how do I do this? And it's so awkward and I don't like it. And, all those kinds of things. And I've done some presentations here at Power to Fly about those topics, that are more on again, going back to that, like the micro level versus the macro level. So a lot of folks just have questions about how to do it, like how to get back into the workforce. But there's also people that have more, they see what's happening around them in their communities, and they feel a sense of like, let's start pushing a little harder to push things forward.
Since transitioning to how we do it, what's what are some things that you've learned that you maybe didn't know when you were doing your previous endeavor?
Oh gosh, I've learned a lot. I'm constantly learning. I think that uh, I've just learned a lot about how employers think about um, talent. I think a lot of employers want to think long term about lots of things, right? Talent, business, lots of things. And it's hard, right? There's the constant need to fill the jobs that we have right now, get through this quarter, right? Make the sales number for the end of the year, and then we'll worry about developing programs to help everybody, and then we'll worry about, right, all of these other things. So there's that constant struggle, I think, for companies to think about how they can support their employees, both their current employees and their future employees, and think about those long-term needs, but also fulfill what they need to do now. So I I think a lot of the reason why employers do hiring the way they do, and which is basically just the same old way, right? The same old way, is because it's easier in terms of short-term results. And it's often hard to prioritize the kinds of changes that would have a long-term impact, but would take more time and energy now. And that's very hard.
How do we move the needle?
Oh, that's a great question. I think that, all right, here's what I'm going to say. I think the war for talent hasn't even begun. And I think that when you look at demographic data, you need to start to be worried. Now, I know that there are all these tech people out there who are going to tell me that AI is eating every job, blah, blah, blah. Maybe, okay, maybe, sure. I don't think so. But here's the reality, right? So the baby boomers are now, like, the youngest baby boomers are like early 60s, right? So they're going. So the earliest baby boomers are in their 60s, and going up to, like, right. Actually, no, I'm sorry. The youngest baby boomers are, the oldest baby boomers are almost 80. The youngest baby boomers are like mid 60s, right? So they're definitely in the retirement, headed into retirement. Some of them are working, some of them are extending. Most of them are in Congress. No, right. So they're right. So the generation that's behind the baby boomers is my generation, Gen X. Gen X is the tiniest cohort we've had. It's the
Hmm.
smallest generation in,
Hmm.
right. So not a lot of us, right? Behind us is the millennial, and the oldest Gen Xers are early 60s, the youngest Gen Xers are like late 40s, right? So again, we're still working, but like getting closer to that, right? The next group is millennials. Now there's more of them than us. There's more of millennials than Gen X, but not as many as the baby boomers, right? And then it falls off a cliff. Gen Z and Gen Alpha are tiny.
Hmm.
So we're not making as many workers as we had. We're not immigrating workers, right? And we haven't been doing that for a long time. That's not just a Trump phenomenon. We weren't doing it under Obama. We weren't, right. Like that's a long-standing issue, right? We're we're not gonna. That's my big
Hmm.
thing, right? So
Hmm.
I think that employers are going to have to start thinking more innovatively about talent, because they're going to have to, because we're just going to start to have fewer people. I think that particularly the baby boom in particular, has made employers. Now we've had good job markets and bad job markets, and good job markets and bad job markets, but for the most part, the last 30, 40 years or so has been an employer's market, because there's lots and lots of people, and lots of, fairly high numbers of college educated people. That's another, that's, we're not making more college educated workers either. Lots of Gen Zers and Gen Alpha are like, is it worth it? A lot of money. Another thing we don't support with public dollars is college, right? So I think employers they're going to be forced, unfortunately, but they're going to be forced to get more creative, because I think there's going to be fewer people. That's my hot take,
I
Hunter.
love it.
You just
I,
you just got my super hot take. We'll
I
see.
love it. I love it. I love it. So we're just about out of time. I would love to ask, we're talking about some pretty heavy stuff. You're talking about it, you're thinking about it a lot, you're writing about it a lot, and yet you have this positive glow about you. So what that wonderful laugh, that wonderful joy, it's infectious.
Thank you.
What, yes, thank you for being here. What gives you hope? And yeah, what gives you hope?
Oh, everything. I mean, my kids probably is the thing
Mm,
that gives me hope, right? Like they're so these I will not sit for any Gen Z slander. I'm not here for the Gen Z slander.
yeah.
They are smart. They are
Yeah.
savvy. They know what's what. They know what's up. They're not buying it. They are not buying what we are selling, my friends. And I think that gives me hope. I think that they're just them. They're in all their amazingness. I don't subscribe to the like the kids are going to save us. I think we should be doing more to save ourselves. But their energy gives me energy.
I love that. Tami Forman, this has been absolutely fantastic. Make sure
Awesome
everybody
as
goes to
always.
tamiforman.substack.com. I imagine you're on LinkedIn as well.
I am.
Great. So that's where we'll find you. Tami, it's always great to have you here. Thank you for making the time.
Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Take care
Bye.
now.